very first thing I need to warn you about is that Helen and I have exactly the same voice. And if I just do like this, you'll think you've already heard me. So it's not your ears, it's true. And we used to be able to get on the phone when a boyfriend would call and wreak havoc on that relationship. You know? Actually, the truth is the boyfriends were calling her, not me. There are two women in particular, who have been role models in my life and who have helped me enormously, and one is Helen. So I was so pleased when I heard that you were going to come. I just learned that this morning. And then the other one, which if you read the book, you'll see was Hillary Clinton. And I really do have to say that I would not have been ambassador if it hadn't been for Hillary, whom I met when she was campaigning for her husband, and I helped put together an event because I thought he was really, really smart on issues, and put together an event in Colorado, and she and I worked together on it some. And afterwards, she was fond of me, and I was fond of her, and we found a way to work together. Anyway, she asked me to be part of the administration, and that's how I ended up being ambassador. Now, I am going to talk about women and the whole issue of how you go about creating a peace in a place that is broken with violent conflict. But as you know, whenever you're getting into a large sort of philosophical issue like that, you need to enter it, if possible, through a specific. Otherwise, the words just float around. And so I would like to bring you into one particular conflict today. And I'll only talk about the general a few minutes, and maybe we will more in the Q&A. But I'd like to bring you to Liberia, which had a raging war. But the war of 14 years followed tremendous difficulty and tragedy for many years before that. And to take you there, I'm going to show you a few minutes of our son's film, which is called Iron Ladies of Liberia. When he learned I was writing my third book, he said, "How quaint." Because he makes films. And in fact, this film has been purchased by 40 countries and will have 200 million viewers. So I guess it'll have 2,200,000, right, with you tonight. So let him introduce you to Liberia with about an 8-minute clip to begin, okay?
This is my country, Liberia. These images are from the civil war that raged in my country for 14 years. A war that stole my childhood and left so many of us with nothing. At the center of it all was our president, Charles Taylor, who spread chaos across Liberia and the region. I'm so sad to know that these are the images people think of when they think of Liberia. My name is Seattle Scott Johnson, and I'm a journalist. A group of us formed Omwati Africa Media at the end of the Civil War to document this new chapter in Liberian history. With the exile of President Taylor and the country's first free and fair elections in my lifetime, we filmed the democratic process in action, focusing on the different presidential candidates. George Weah, Liberia's famous soccer star, was favored by all to be our next president. He held a commanding lead in the primary, but not enough to avoid a runoff against a runner-up, a woman. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. Sirleaf, a former finance minister known as the Iron Lady, gradually convinced Liberians she was the best person for the job.
You are the ones who are going to stand and take this country forward.
And on November 23, 2005, with 60% of the vote, she won the election to become our 23rd president and Africa's first elected female president. The world is watching Liberia in a new way now. They want to see if a woman can make a difference, if a woman can lead us in peace and turn our country around. Of course, I'm interested too, not just as a journalist, but as a Liberian, as a mother, and as a woman. We asked the president if we could join her and her team for her first year in office, a year which would determine the future of our country. She said yes.
Put your hands together for Liberia. Put your hands together for peace.
Mrs. Dora Bush, wife of the President of the United States of America, is the Secretary of State, Her Excellency Dr. Condoleezza Rice.
It's amazing how she can stay so calm and collective. She functions better under pressure.
I think there's too many years of being through too many kinds of experiences. After a while, you get hardened. And you take it all in stride, the good and the bad. Today's probably going to surpass it all. I think for obvious reasons. You don't get inaugurated. And for the first time in our country's history, it's a woman, and Africa is represented here so fully.
Republic of Liberia.
Of the Republic of Liberia.
To the best of my ability.
To the best of my ability.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Congratulations.
Fellow Liberians, we know that your vote was a vote for change. We have heard you loudly. The days of the imperial presidency of a domineering and threatening chief executives are over. God bless you all and save the Republic.
Madam President, what a joy it is.
Mommy always said to us, the day Ellen was born, this baby is going to be great. And so over the years, we always laughed, said, where is this greatness? And we just hope that this will be the realization of those dreams and goals.
Hear, hear.
Yes.
When we were playing that song, Woman Takes Your Time, sometimes I found myself nodding and trying to dance. I said, no, that's also dancing. I'm a woman and it takes my time, but I'm a journalist too. I have a responsibility to be neutral. The president, Madam Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, has a lot to do to please Liberians and to make this country a stable place. Liberia is a country where 90% of our people are unemployed and frustration can turn into violence at any moment. Where calm is held together by the presence of the world's largest peacekeeping force, our last president, Charles Taylor, was exiled to Nigeria, and the previous 2 presidents were assassinated. The infrastructure is destroyed. There is no running water or electricity anywhere in the country. And our debt is 30 times greater than our national budget. The problems are immense. Me, I've got a family. I've got 2 kids, and I want our country to be different than the one I grew up in. So we are all hoping that a woman can make a difference.
Never been the president before, but I feel good about it. I'm humbled by the enormity of the challenge, no doubt about that. And I have anxieties because I want to get on with it so I can get on this long road to success. But I feel good about it.
So there she is, and there were a whole bunch of us here in the U.S. who were working on that election to have this first democratically elected female in all of Africa. And since she has come on board, are we doing okay, Caitlin? The literacy rate has gone up, and the economic growth is going up, and corruption is down. The history, as was alluded to, is that, and many of you know this, it was the American freed slaves that went back in this movement from the American Colonization Society. And so that's how you end up with the name Liberia, and in fact Monrovia, the capital for James Monroe. And then, that's the only colony the U.S. had in Africa. So that's why you have this really close relationship between the 2 countries. And that's why Liberia has not just cities and towns, but actual counties and a House of Representatives and the Senate and Supreme Court. In other words, they use all of the same terms that we have here. And it's really a tragic story because the same people who had experienced the oppression of slavery here, when they went back, this is really a study in human nature, isn't it? They went back and oppressed the indigenous people who were there. And so then you ended up with all this strife again until finally the indigenous Samuel Doe took over. And people said, at last, we are overcoming this terrible history. But he was truly, truly terrible. And you have brutalities and massacres. And, there is something that power does. I mean, everyone can recite in their sleep the adage that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But it's that kind of story that you see in Liberia. And so now all of a sudden there are the tremendous tensions again. There are multiple tribes in Liberia, and human rights are just gone, and when you have those kinds of tensions, the living conditions plummet because the war will destroy the schools, it'll destroy the communities. You have these mass migrations of people. So enter Charles Taylor, and it's very interesting that he actually lived in Massachusetts for several years and went to Bentley College there, and he was a born-again Christian, as was Jimmy Carter. And so Carter said, at last, here's someone that we can feel really safe about and feel very proud of. And there were other born-again leaders who felt the same way. And he became an official inside of the Doe government. He was actually the Minister of Economics, and then he was forced to resign and for embezzlement, and was imprisoned, and then there was a trial in the United States to extradite him. Now, he was very much a restless exile, and in fact marshaled forces and invaded from the neighboring Côte d'Ivoire, the Ivory Coast. And then you have this tremendously tumultuous time where you ended up with many warring factions, at some points 3, at some points 7, other times 13, and this chaos. And then out of that comes Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who runs against Charles Taylor. She gets 10% of the vote. And by the way, Jimmy Carter was an observer. He had the Carter Center there and said, it's such a relief to have this fair election. I love Jimmy Carter. Don't get me wrong, but I mention that to say that it's very hard to figure out these allegiances when you're in the moment. So then Carter takes power, and again you have the chaos and the living conditions deteriorate, and then you have more rebels, and they are encroaching on. Taylor's trying to fight them off, and then he finally goes into Nigeria, where he is arrested with pressure from, it doesn't say, there it is, the Bush administration. And so he's then brought back in to stand trial. In terms of the U.S. relationship with Liberia, that foreign dependence, which began very early, was continued then with multiple companies who were bidding for the timber and the diamonds and the rubber. And then the Cold War came, and Liberia was, do you remember how Africa was all divided up between the communists and the free world? And Liberia became very important in that respect. And so we poured money into the Liberian military to build it up. And we had all kinds of international organizations that were very important to Western Africa who also were intervening. That's called ECOWAS at the top, and they intervened to stop Taylor, and that didn't work. And so then a UN mission went in, and they were able to provide enough peace and stability to have elections. So here we come to the elections. And by the way, on the right, you see an Indian contingent from the UN peacekeepers. And if you want to know more about them, we'll tell you more. It's 125, all women, which is a great move because all of the accusations, all the atrocities that the UN peacekeepers have committed against the Liberians, the Liberian girls and women. Okay, so it's 2003, the state is feeling stable. You've got the 15,000 peacekeepers. That's the second largest in all the world. There's 17,000 in Congo next door, but Congo is enormous compared to little old Liberia. Liberia has about 3 million people. Congo, I'm going to guess 60 million. And so that gives you a sense of the role of the peacekeepers there. And what happens? The women stand up. Take a minute to read the sign. It was one of my favorite in Monrovia. Oops, yes. And the women got organized. And they organized to elect Ellen. Now, this was unprecedented, and it was the women who got sick and tired of the war, and they not only were delivering the food across the lines, the enemy lines, but they actually started themselves going to the rebel leaders and saying, you've got to put down your arms, and negotiating with them. There was a Women of Liberia Mass Action Peace campaign. They went all around the country to secure the peace. And there's a wonderful story of the women, at one point when the rebels had gotten together, they surrounded where the meeting place was happening and refused to let the rebels leave. And it took like 4 or 5 days until the talks were completed. The women were very involved in the disarmament and the demobilization of the soldiers, and they even, after the peace agreement was created, they held a conference to explain it to the people, and they went all over the country to unpack that. Now, so here come these elections in 2005, and these are going to be the first free elections. You saw George Weah up there, the soccer star. The soccer star had never completed high school. And here he is running for president. Now, remember, though, that after 14 years of war, if you're 21, you have not, you've only been to second grade. And that was 14 years ago. So you have this huge portion of the population who cannot read or write. So the women, that's a typo. It should say 51%. I like the 51 women to 1 man, but that's not how it was. So it was so hard to get the women registered to vote because they were refugees and they were in IDP, internally displaced people, camps. And yet the Minister of Gender took this on as a mission, and she was emailing me, and I had my BlackBerry, and she said, "How do I do this?" And I was saying, "Well, it's called Get Out the Vote." And and I'm emailing her these long emails, from wherever I am on vacation, and she said, "Well," I said, "they've got to come to Monrovia at least every few weeks." She said, "But we don't have roads." And I said, "Well, have them take the train." She said, "All the railways are destroyed." I said, "Oh, what about a boat?" She said, the port is destroyed. I said, I don't know what you're going to do. She said, "We'll find a way." And the stories that she tells of what it was like trying to get from one town to another, they're harrowing. Here she is, the Minister of Gender, and she's sleeping by the side of the road, and rats are running over her feet. And it was really, really tough. But they got the women organized. And at the bottom, the Ministry of Gender people organized childcare for the women to go and register and then to vote. They provided them whatever transportation they could to go from the refugee camps to wherever the voting was happening. And I love the last one. The educated women went and sat in the markets so that the market women could go and register to vote. So they sat in their stalls. That is how much of a unified effort it was. And Ellen Johnson Sirleaf makes no bones about it. She says, "The women of Liberia elected me." So let's say, why this woman, and is it so important? I've been, by the way, 3 times for a week since her inauguration, and so that's where a lot of these pictures come from. Well, let me give you a little bit of background on her. She had 4 sons before she went to college. I love to tell that to people at places like this. She actually had been the Minister of Finance under Charles Taylor and had been imprisoned and tortured by him. And then she was she went into exile. And then she got her education, as you can see, not just in Africa, but in the United States. And then she had all kinds of other official positions that made her particularly equipped for this position. And she sums up, here are some of the accomplishments that she's been able to bring about. There was sanction on the timber and the diamonds, because this is blood diamonds. How many of you have seen the film Blood Diamonds? So, this is, Sierra Leone and Liberia. So she's finally been able to get those sanctions lifted, but it took a whole year to do that. Now, the debt is unbelievable. It's about $30,000 per person, as I recall. So it's completely unrealistic. And a lot of that debt came from these corrupt leaders beforehand. She promised the people that she would have electricity in Monrovia within the first, I think it was 30 days. They were able to flip on the lights for a portion, for about a quarter of the city. And when they did, there was some probably wiring. It probably wasn't arson. But then the White House, in her not mansion, but the big building in which she lived, burned. So, I mean, it's like one step forward, 6 steps back at times. She walked in to the corrupt finance ministry, and she said, I'd like to see your papers. And this is before her finance minister arrived. She said, I'd like to see your papers. Well, the finance ministry didn't even have any paper, much less the people working there. And so they all sort of looked at her, and she said, you need to then apply to the Civil Servants Bureau. This is the Ministry of Corruption. Well, the Civil Service Bureau didn't have any paper either to write on. I mean, this is really, really, really bare bones. Like, there's no sewage system. Everything is destroyed. So what does she do? And this is why this is such a great case study. She appoints women to these positions here. Now, you would expect it as gender and development, maybe youth and sports, but commerce, justice, and finance, and chief of police, I mean, that really has gotten the world's attention. This is her quote, and she's so right. The country is rich in natural resources. That's the irony, and that's the good news, actually. Okay, now this brings us to the question of why it's important to have women in positions like this. And I always feel like I risk sounding chauvinistic when I say these things. And normally I have about 10 different reasons, but I'm going to spare you that and just go to a few. First, to remind you that there are many, many, many countries out there. If you count the monarchs and the presidents and the heads of government, our country combines head of government and head of state into one president. Most don't. Most have a prime minister and a president. I haven't counted them, but I would guess there are at least 300 people in those positions, and of those 300, there are 20 women. And that's, we get all excited about Angela Merkel, and Bachelet. Well, there's a reason to get excited, but it's not because women are doing so much better. It's because, these are lone voices. And why aren't they there in politics? It's because they're in NGOs, and they hate politics, and that's a whole other subject. But you can see my article in Foreign Affairs in May and June that analyzes that. You can see the gender gap between men and women in countries is actually closing in education and health, but it's not in the political empowerment. The only places where you start getting any kind of closing, but it's still way behind, is when you have a quota. And it's amazing how many countries have some kind of quota, all different kinds. Maybe it's in the political party, has to have 30% women, or 20% of the seats in the parliament have to be for women, and it's done a dozen different ways. But in spite of all of that, you still only get an average of 17%. And by the way, does anyone know where the United States is in terms of ranking for women in parliament? I think I hear you. 17? No. In terms of where we are in the world, we are 68th. Yeah. And it's partly because we don't have a quota. So what's the difference it makes that if you have women in government? Well, really interesting, and maybe surprising or not, you actually get less corruption. when you have women in the higher positions. And there are multiple studies. There are about 5 studies now that are showing that. Another difference is it's not just in the parliament that there's less corruption, but actually in the labor force and the senior government positions. Of course, the World Bank is very interested in this. And other studies are showing that women, they're not more trusting, but they are more trustworthy. So that story that I told you about Ellen Johnson Sirleaf going into the Ministry of Finance turns out to not be a surprise to people who follow this, who are following the research. The other piece is that there's an important study done by the Interparliamentary Union, which looks at parliaments all over the world. And they say that when they interviewed all of these female politicians in countries everywhere, that there was a large majority who said that if you have higher percentage of women, then the public trust goes up in terms of how people feel about government. And so it's going to be really interesting watching this election, because often it's very, 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 very hard for a woman to be elected. But after she is elected, she tends to be reelected because people feel so good about the government and what's happening there. Now, I've mentioned to you many of Ma Ellen's challenges. And by the way, when people say, does it make any difference that you're a woman? She'll say, well, first of all, I am a technocrat, and I'm a very good technocrat. And then she'll pause and she'll say, but you know, as a woman, I think I understand how to bring people together, as we often do in our families. And as a grandmother, I think about the future generations. But wow, I've described a little bit about the infrastructure. I mean, you really have to be there to believe it. And the education, I mentioned jobs, 85% unemployment, which is very, very dangerous because people do something with their time. And what the guys have done in the past is be part of these militias. And then the security sector. She has a corrupt police force, corrupt army with terrible violent histories. And she's got to go in and try to reform both of those. And this I wanted to remind us all of. I was just at the UN mission in Monrovia. And the head of the mission was so frustrated. He said, you know, we're coming up on 2 years. She has a closing window because the people are only going to wait a certain period of time before they begin to go back into war. And 6 months of the year is rainy season. So you can't do a lot of construction. And the World Bank, for example, has promised that they're going to do all of this construction in the roads. But, you know, they're about 2 months now into the dry season of the second year. And there's been no work. And they say, well, you know, it's very complicated. I mean, one of them said, well, you know, our database still shows Liberia as a country at war, and so therefore, you know, we're having to go through certain procedures that we wouldn't otherwise. I mean, can you believe they're relying on a database rather than the facts? So anyway, we could tell you stories like that times 2,000. And these stories, while they may seem ludicrous, I mean, it's kind of like Iraq or Iran with this administration. You can say, you know, well, this is ludicrous, but the results are tragic in terms of human life. And so there really is a sense of urgency and at the same time a sense of possibility. And when people say, well, you know, what can we do about this? Well, actually, the president has established 2 important ways for people to respond. One is through a Market Women's Fund, and it was the Market Women who elected her. And they need shelter over their heads, especially during the rainy season. And then this education trust, which is really interesting because they're getting people to give money that then pays for the supplies, but the people on the ground have to build the schools themselves. So this is, as I said, one close look into a conflict so that you can see how this woman is dealing with it. Let me open this up for any thoughts you have, any questions, either about Liberia or about what I said about the difference it makes if you have women in these positions. Women are particularly working across lines all over the world. So what thoughts do you have? Yes. Yes. We were so many of it. I started crying. She was saying, and there is a mic up there, but she was saying that she was so pleased when I chose Liberia and how excited we were when we heard she was elected. And it was right before Angela Merkel, too. And yeah, I was in China watching CNN, and I just hadn't thought it possible because I knew how she did in the first, I think there were maybe 23 people running for president, and she didn't. I mean, she maybe had, I don't know, 18% of the vote, but there were so many people in the field that put her in the runoff against George Weah, who had twice as higher percent, and then she ended up winning. Yes? Yes. Well, the mood, I would say it's going down because you heard or you'll hear people talk about, she promised us so much, and is it okay if I leave that? She promised us so much, and she's not delivering on the promises. And one of her frustrations is that there's a lot of NGO activity, but it's being done outside the government. So here she has this minuscule budget of $160 million for the whole government. $160 million. And well, let me just tell you that she's trying to bring people from the diaspora back, like these ministers, and she's got to find housing for them, and she's got to give them some kind of salary. So that's at the ministerial level. And then the deputy ministers, maybe half of them have the skills they need. Assistant ministers, very, very, very few. That's what I work on. I go over and I do consultations and training with these women. They're good-hearted. They are well-intentioned. They may be intelligent, but they don't know how to make a record of phone calls. I mean, they don't know how to keep books of finances. The women in the Ministry of Gender who are under the assistant secretary level, they're paid $3 a day. Transportation in the capital costs more than $3 a day, which means they have to walk from wherever they live. So they may be walking for an hour to get to work. So she doesn't have what she needs. The mood has certainly gone down. The bloom is off the rose. And we ought to be helping her in any way we can in terms of building schools. Are there men involved? Sure. The defense minister, we spent a lot of time together in my last trip. And he seems like a very good guy. And he's trying to figure out how, interestingly, you get the new army to have 30% women. Because it will change not only the behavior of the men, but it'll change the way people feel about the army to see the women there. You know, you change the whole image of the army. Yes. We're talking about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in such a traumatized country. It is starting, but it's not very far along at all. This is not South Africa, where you have a whole infrastructure. And in fact, when I was there, my first visit, I left behind my movie camera intentionally so that they could use it to gather testimony. But, you know, when you have 60 to 70% of the women who've been raped, many of them gang raped, you don't have to go very far to look for the damage. And the real question is, you know, what kind of process you set up so that people can feel like they can move on. But it hasn't gotten very far yet. It's starting. Look, I was, in the last visit, I took over a federal judge who was appointed in the earlier administration before this one, and she's in Massachusetts. And she said she wanted to go over and help, so she came over. And I had a friend there who was the Solicitor General in charge of all the trials in Liberia, and I'd known him from Harvard when he was at the Center for Human Rights. And so I called him and I said, Tiawan, I could bring over Judge Gertner, and if you'd like, and she can consult with you for a week, and she can watch your court trials and give you some thoughts. And he said, let me check my schedule. And I said, well, look, if you're not going to be there, that's fine, because she could work with, whoever is your stand-in, your number two. Silence. Can you imagine? You're trying to do these trials. I mean, his wife told me he gets up at 5 a.m, he gets home at midnight. He's trying to put together a whole justice system with the Minister of Justice, and they don't have trained lawyers. Yeah, so it's really, really tough. Now, I don't want to leave you feeling depressed. So what I'd like to do is take you back to Liberia for the last few minutes. And is there someone up there who's doing the lights? Can you bring them all the way down instead of just part way? And if it's possible to turn this one off, please do, if you can get the stoplight off. Spotlight. This last piece, it begins, or right before this, you have Antoinette Saya, who's the Minister of Finance, saying, I am so worried because if we can't get this money moving, it's just what I was saying to you, if we can't get this money moving, the country is going to unravel. And you're going to watch the president as she goes to confront Firestone, because Firestone Rubber Company has been there for decades. And you're going to see how she deals not just with the Firestone people, but then how she has to deal with her own people. And that crisis of conscience that those of us who have studied theology or who are out there in the world trying to be the people of God, we are constantly pushed up against these moments that collide inside of ourselves when every choice seems imperfect. As Viktor Frankl said to me, he was my mentor in Vienna, and you know him from Man's Search for Meaning. He said, sometimes, Ambassador Hunt, the right thing to do is only 40 or 55% right, and it's 45% wrong. And that wrong is staring you in the face. So think of Viktor Frankl now as you watch one more scene with Ellen Johnson Sirleaf.
More than any other country, our partnership with the U.S. is most valuable. After all, Liberia was founded by freed slaves from the U.S., and we've always been very dependent of that relationship.
I think we depend upon the support of some of our partners, but I feel that in many instances we give them some of our primary commodities in return. We gave huge benefits to their corporations which operate here. So it's not one-sided.
We've just arrived in Firestone, our plantation, the largest plantation and the largest employer in Liberia. This place being under a little bit of attention for the past 2 months. The workers went on strike. I had to bring in police and things went off hand. It resorted to the attack of 2 persons. So these tensions have drawn the president's attention. And she has to come in to do something quickly and something positive.
Good morning, Madam President. Welcome to Firestone.
At the heart of the trouble is an unfulfilled wage increase. Years ago, Charles Taylor promised a Firestone worker a 37.5% raise. Ellie must decide whether she will side with the workers or this huge company.
This is my living area.
Is this the only place you have?
That's the only room.
And where do you use as your bathroom?
No bathroom. Bathe right behind the house. Wait to get down before bathe behind the house.
Just behind the house. Are you in school?
Well, I'm in school.
For what?
No, Adika. You're not born part of the hospital.
All right. We came to here we are set to see with our own eyes.
Thank you.
Firestone has been here since 1926. There is no reason for the workers in Firestone to live under the conditions they live. We are not going to accept it. We are not going to accept the fact that people live in houses that have no windows, that people live in houses where there is not schooling for them. Firestone has made enough money in this country to have treated the Liberian workers in a much better way. Our responsibility as the government is to make sure that the workers' rights are protected, that their benefits are fair, that they are treated properly, and this government is committed to that, because that's the message we're taking to the workers.
While Ellen was inside talking with Firestone's management, the workers were waiting outside for an answer about their raise.
With all this big job, is there any reason why we have to keep the people outside?
Sir, don't say. Please bring it.
We're going inside. We can't keep them behind the fence. There may be times when regional and international desires conflict. I'm not a perfect person, so when I have to make a political compromise, I struggle with my conscience.
The company been wrong because they paid us in 1926 and they're not doing right by the workers. So we told them what you would do about better housing, what you would do about education. But the main thing that says 37.5%. So then we went. So we started. Well, now, you know all I always say, so don't clap first. But the president then, Mr. Taylor, he came, March 1992, he came, and he put out one law. The problem come from bad government. So we look at that side at 37.5%. We say, well, this one here is hard. Let's tell the truth. We can't force the company on that one.
When the president talked to the Firestone workers, they, in response, were not happy. But the citizens of Liberia are, unlike they used to hearing the truth from politicians and people in power.
Nobody was willing to go and tell them the truth. They just expected here comes another president who's going to tell us and make a promise, and we'll go back cheering, exulting. And nothing was going to happen.
We are experiencing a new kind of democracy. It will be hard to experience, but as time goes by, we will get adjusted to it.
Are we ready? Ready or not, we've got to get on the path.
I may face demonstration, I may face anger, but I think in the end it's good for our country, and it's good for the path that we've chosen.
That's her life every day. Every day. She works 7 days a week, 14 hours a day. She's about 63, 65 years old. She's living in very, very difficult circumstances. And let me end this with a challenge. You don't have to go to Liberia to see this kind of tension, to see this kind of stress, to see hardship. We're surrounded by it. And don't think of this then as some exotic problem that you can say, well, it's way far away. I don't really have the skills. I can't afford to get on the plane. Listen, you can afford to look around 5 blocks. So I hope that you'll experience this evening, having seen Liberia in a way as a stand-in for your own life. And as Helen said, who are the champions of peace? They are you. They must be you. As Ellen would say, you're all we've got, ready or not. And none of us feels ready. So ready or not, I call you to be the peacemakers. Thank you so much for having me.